at 4 p.m. if you want to go ahead and get started.
Okay, let's do it. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're coming through clear.
Fantastic. All right, everyone. Welcome to this week's Crow Canyon webinar with Dr. Christopher Roos. We are going to jump right in, but before, I just want to say a few quick words. First, Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache, people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits and upon which we work and reside. So our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. So our mission here at Crow Canyon is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, through experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. So thank you for all of your support for the webinar series. And just a few quick kind of housekeeping things about Zoom. I know that everyone's really a pro at this point, please put all of your questions in the Q&A area. If you put them in the chat, it's very likely we won't see them. And if you're having any difficulties, you can head over to Facebook, where we're also streaming this event. Okay, and then we also just want to mention some upcoming webinars. So next week is on iridescent beetle adornment and the Bears Ears National Monument. And then the week after that, we have federal Indian boarding schools in Colorado. So please join us for those. And now I'll introduce Chris Roos. So Chris is an environmental archaeologist and professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University. He received his master's and PhD degrees from the University of Arizona in 2002 and 2008, and a bachelor's from the University of Cincinnati in 2000. His primary areas of interest and expertise are in human pyrogeography and behavioral geoarchaeology. So for 2 decades, he has been directing interdisciplinary research projects on the long-term interactions of human societies, climate, and wildfire in the Southwest. And more recently, he has expanded his fire work to include collaborative research projects in Montana, Fiji, and Australia. So welcome, Chris, and I will stop sharing right now and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who's here to be a part of this. I want to also extend thanks, of course, to the folks at the Pueblo of Jemez, good friends and collaborators there who made this research possible, and whose ancestors kind of shine a light towards ways to coexist with wildfire today that simply wouldn't be possible without learning from their legacy. So I'll go ahead and kind of get started. I want to say that the work that I'm talking about here is part of a larger push within archaeology to make our work relevant for contemporary issues. The books here at the top are just some examples of those, not meant to be exhaustive or to be an endorsement of any particular set of interpretations associated with those books. Just to say that I'm not alone, I'm not weird. I'm doing something that fits within a kind of a growing trajectory of what you might think of as applied archaeology. And the problem, or the contemporary issue that I chose about 2 decades ago, when the Rodeo Chediskai fire scorched more than 400,000 acres in eastern Arizona and drove my friends and colleagues from the Arizona Archaeological Field School from their home, well, their base camp there, is wildfire. And it's probably well covered in the media now that we certainly have growing issues. California is probably the poster child for this Last year was not a record-breaking fire year for California. They only had about 2.5 million acres burned. Their record year was a couple of years ago, 2020, when more than 4 million acres burned, burning thousands of structures and more than a couple dozen fatalities associated with this. And of course, that came just a couple years after the previous historic fire season in California, which was 2018, thousands of fires, about 2 million acres burned, billions and billions in total cost, both fire suppression and insurance payouts, nearly 20,000 structures lost, and more than 100 fatalities due to the tragic situation in Paradise, California. And that, of course, came on the heels of the very distant historic fire year of 2017, when thousands of fires burned about 1.5 million acres, again, with billions in suppression and insurance payouts and dozens of fatalities. But this is not just California, right? There are other places both in the US and in the West, but also internationally, right? 2017 was a big year on the Iberian Peninsula as well, not on the scale of California in terms of acres burned, but thousands of fires burned about 250,000 acres with really deadly consequences because of the nature of the cultural landscape in Portugal and Spain. Even places that we don't think of as being particularly flammable, they are. Like in the southeast, in the Smoky Mountains, we had a wildfire in November of 2016 that was relatively small by the standards of the things we're talking about in California, about 18,000 acres, but thousands of structures lost and more than a dozen fatalities. Even my current state of residence, Texas, has been in on the act of historic fire years in the last decade-ish. In the year 2011, we had our record fire year. That happens to be my first full year in Texas, but I'm pretty sure that's just a coincidence. Tens of thousands of fires, 4 million acres burned, hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, mostly with the thousands of structures burned outside of Fort Worth and Austin. So as a historical scientist, one thing that stands out to me right away in terms of certainly the Western set of fire challenges is that there's a lack of recognition in Western communities of the historical role of fire in shaping these places. We're attracted to the natural amenities and beauty of these places without an awareness of the historical role of fire, that it's fundamental, that fire is in effect unavoidable in these places. But the archaeologist in me also wants to point out to those who study the history of fire that there's a long human history in these same places. And I really love this particular photo, which is of the Pueblo of Taos for a 2003 fire burning in the watershed behind the Pueblo. And you see the gentleman sitting on the Pueblo watching this fire burn. And this is a place that's been occupied for at least 1,000 years. And I can guarantee you that's not the first time people have sat on top of that Pueblo and watched fires burning on the landscape around it. But I can also almost guarantee you that that is the hottest fire anyone there ever would have seen. And so therein lies the conundrum, right? That fire is and has been present, but there's something about the fire situation now that's just not quite right. I'm going to focus today, and this has been the focus of my research for quite some time, on a particular ecosystem in the Southwest. And these are the dry pine forests that are dominated by the ponderosa pine tree. These are kind of semi-arid forests that historically were very open, had a very grassy understory. There are a lot of historical descriptions of being able to ride your horses at a gallop through these forests, something more or less like what you're seeing here from the History Grove in the Valles Caldera. And one of the reasons that I chose this forest type for my work is because this has one of the best known historical fire regimes in the world. And that is thanks to tree ring dating and the characteristic of both the adaptation of that species and the preservation of fire damage on living trees that are these fire scars. You see here on the right what they look like on a living tree, and then what they look like in cross section over here. And we can actually date the occurrence both to the year and in many cases actually to the part of the growing season when these fires happen, going back several centuries. And we know from a network of nearly 5,000 trees across the Southwest that fires happen in a stand of trees once every 3 to 15 years on average. That it burned in the surface fuels, like you see here, mostly grasses, down needles, down branches, that this thinned out a lot of young trees, creating for a very open stand structure and a lot of grass and herbaceous plants in that understory. And also that there's a very strong relationship between interannual moisture patterns driven by El Nino, La Nina switching. That, of course, is not the way fires are happening in those same forest types now. Right? These dry pine forests present across the western U.S., and now those fires are burning through the trees over enormous areas, right? 100,000 acres, up to 500,000 acres. And we had our first million-acre fire in California in 2020. And so what used to burn in the surface like this now it burns in these incredibly high intensity fires with, in some cases, really extreme fire behavior, spawning, fire tornadoes and leaving landscapes like this, right, where there's no living seed tree around. And this is not going to come back as forest. It can't come back as forest. There are no seeds to do it. This is going to become something else. And as recent research is showing, a lot of these are coming back as shrub fields. And I point the finger, as Smokey is here, I pointed at Smokey. A big part of the problem has been that for the last century, we have been trying to convince ourselves and done a pretty good job of it, that we could somehow live without fire, right? That fire was something that we could exclude, and that our preference culturally, economically, from a policy standpoint, was to wipe out fire entirely from these forests. And not only was that not possible, of course, it's been creating the situation where the forests are choked with fuels, meaning that they can't even burn the way that they used to, that they burn in these much more high intensity ways. And so the question shouldn't be, Smokey's cultural proposition, how to live without fire. We need to recognize that fire is going to be there no matter what. And it's the question is, what kind of fire do we want to live with? Not whether or not we can, but what kind. And similarly, and necessarily, what kind of smoke can we live with? Knowing the burdens that smoke can play on human health, right? What kind of smoke are we going to accept in these big, really catastrophic chunks like you see on the right, or maybe in some chronic, regular, but lower intensity way associated with much more frequent burning? And we tried to approach these things and to help us out, because we lack cultural tools, partly thanks to Smokey, to deal with fire in any way other than as a hazard, right? As a hazard to be avoided. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with my work in the Southwest is begin to populate a menu of options, not to tell us what to do, but to let us understand what is possible in these places, so that we can make good choices about where to live and how to interact with these flammable places. What I'm talking about today is some of the results of the Jemez Fire and Humans in Resilient Ecosystems project, or Jemez Fire project for short. This was selected by Tom Swetnam, my collaborator, and I, because of the unique properties of the archaeological record here, which was a relatively high density human landscape that persisted into the tree ring record in these pine forests. And I say relatively high density because this has a kind of a special salience for fire management problems today, and something that we call the wildland-urban interface, which is the very challenging fire management context in which you've got low to moderate housing that is either interspersed with or abutting wildland fuels and wildland environments. And in this case, we have an ancient wildland-urban interface. And so we can look at the sustainability of such a context and what kind of practices help to produce that over multiple centuries. This is just a map of what the modern wildland-urban interface looks like. For those of you who might be interested, the red and the yellow are two different categories of the wildland-urban interface. You can see that actually a lot of it's in the east, in the southeast, whereas the Sierra Nevada is another big one. That's a big problem for California, but places in the Colorado Front Range, northern New Mexico, and the mountains of Arizona are also parts of this, as well as Pacific Northwest. And we're also taking a coupled human natural systems approach to this, where we look at the interactions, not just between people and fire directly, but through the network of interactions between human resource use that in turn have impacts on fuel abundance or fuel quantity or fuel distribution that impact the way that fires can spread and the type of intensity of those fires. And so we need to do this a very interdisciplinary approach. And so we put together a team of folks to look at a number of dimensions of this problem, both archaeology, to look at the human history, ethnography, talking with native peoples, geoarchaeology, dendrochronology, and ecological modeling. For the ethnography, we spent a lot of time going out to field sites, not archaeological sites, but to forests of different condition, burned and unburned, those that have been thinned, those that had not, like the ones here on the left, we call a dog hair thicket, talking about forest health, smoke, fire, resources, to try to understand, how our native collaborators perceived these contexts and found value or hazard in them. For the archaeology, we were fortunate to have been out doing our work at the same time that the Southwest Jemez Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project was going on, because they flew a LiDAR over the whole area that we were working in. And so we were able to actually use LiDAR to map the sites in great detail, including measuring rubble volume and using that to calculate populations very precisely. But we also, and this work was led by my colleague, Matt Liebman, went out and laid out a grid across these sites and collected ceramics to try to work out spatial differences and kind of the chronology of these very large pueblos. For the paleoecology, we had kind of two major kind of field programs. One that was a geoarchaeological one that involved coring sedimentary contexts to reconstruct fire and vegetation histories from pollen, charcoal, and various chemical properties of the soils and sediments, but also tree ring sampling for climate reconstruction, for fire reconstruction, but also for some archaeological purposes that I'll talk about. And then we try to tie all this together with ecological modeling, looking at different scenarios of possible land use strategies informed from the ethnography to look at what the consequences would be compared to, say, an imaginary landscape that had no people. We kind of ran the tape without them as a null. And so a few things just about Jemez before I go into this. I'm not going to structure this in a very conventional science talk sort of way, where I go through our methods, and then we go through our results, and then we do some interpretation discussion, and then a conclusion. Instead, what I want to do is actually talk about some of the implications, right? The applied archaeology implications, and then give you some of the evidence that I used to make those inferences. And so I want to give you a little bit about Jemez to understand those things before we jump into it. Jemez folks were living in these forests, as corroborated by archaeology, in pueblos from about 1100 to 1700 of the Common Era. This was unquestionably a wildland-urban interface for agricultural folks, with more than 10 people per square kilometer from the 1300s to the mid 1600s. And I say that this is a true wildland urban interface because more than 10 people per square kilometer would actually put this in that higher density yellow, I think it was, category on that map that I showed you, if the Department of Interior had been around 500 years ago. And so here's where we are, just to ground you in space. I'll show this map a few times. So if you look at the Millennium Falcon of the Jemez Mountains here, right here in the southwestern part, the red outline is what we call the Jemez footprint, or the agricultural landscape, mapped out from the distribution of field house sites and pueblos. The black hatched areas are the sedimentary locations. The white dots are tree ring stands or individual trees for the smaller ones. And the blue circles are studies that weren't ours, that just happened to be out there, that I'll talk about one of those. So the first lesson that I think we take away from Jemez is that Jemez communities were fire wise. And I use that term in quotes and explicitly here, because fire wise is kind of a public education program that is designed to convince homeowners to rearrange their landscape with defensible space and flammability in mind. And so this figure here on the right kind of illustrates one representation of the firewise kind of landscape, with a green lawn in the immediate vicinity that's basically inflammable. This is fireproof. Moving necessary items that are still highly flammable to an outer ring, and then selectively thinning the forest around this, and notice not having trees anywhere near the structure, so that if a fire were to come, it would drop down onto the forest floor because it wouldn't have enough trees to carry it, and then it would hit this defensible space, and it would be basically ineffective at damaging the house. Well, we think that this is true for the Jemez because for about a handful of large pueblos, we went and collected all of the old wood on and around the pueblos. And the idea here originally was to be able to date the last of the occupation of the pueblo, with the assumption that small trees would be trampled and living trees were probably not tolerated, and they certainly couldn't grow on the ruin blocks while people were there. And we went out at some distance from this site in particular, and kept collecting, including fire-scarred material. But for up to 200 meters, 2 football fields around these big pueblos, there was not a single living tree around these. These were completely denuded of trees right around the pueblo. And if you imagine that with 1,000 to 2,000 feet and daily traffic, trampling fine fuels or harvesting kindling and cutting small trees for fireplaces, you get something that's very much like this, right? With an inflammable, defensible space in the interior, no trees nearby, and then progressively thinned, moving outwards. And this is repeated over and over again at each one of these sites that we looked at. And I should say, this is not an artifact of the method. This is not just that, well, there weren't many trees alive past then anyway, since most of this were the occupation ceased in the 1630s. Well, if you get a little further down here, the same mesa, we've got trees that go into the 1400s. We've got fires happening in the 1500s and the early 1600s, not that far away, maybe half a kilometer away from this pueblo. So it's not a limitation of say, the tree growth in general. We also know, we think, that Jemez people managed both fire and fuels. It wasn't just ignitions or using fire to fight fire or fire as a tool. They were also managing fuels. And we know this a lot from the ethnography. This is a really great image that John Welch and TJ Ferguson put together from the ethnography, documenting 27 uses of fire and fuel from different zones in Jemez life. Both the domestic to the village to the agricultural landscape and the forests and woodlands between and beyond. And it's notable that most of these are about fuels, fuel collection for burning in what we might think of as a feature context, or kind of a defined or controlled context. And a handful of these are about, I think of as broadcast burning. But we don't know that they were definitely managing fire as well. Here on the upper left, This is charcoal from those sedimentary locations, and this has been standardized relative to the average for the last 4,000 years. And what you can see in the blue is the period of documented Hamish occupation. Right, the highest levels of charcoal come from that period. So there's more fire, or at least more charcoal production happening on the landscape during that period of time than in the many centuries beforehand. So they're adding fire, that's for sure. But those fires were largely small and low intensity. One way that we know that they were low intensity comes from a really fun study that we did on the side while we were out there, which was to look at fire impacts on the dating of archaeological ceramics. So some of you might already know that there's a dating method called luminescence that allows you to use the firing of the pottery as a clock. And so what it does is it basically frees these traps of electrons in the quartz minerals in the temper, and then from radiation it accumulates electrons again, and that's your clock over time. And the way that you do it is because the heat releases the original ones that had been there. So that's your we call it a resetting event. And we had one of these pueblos that we have all these fire scarred trees, all the white dots. So we knew that there was a fire history around this going back multiple centuries and probably long before that. That's as far as we could go with the trees around this pueblo that had burned over it. And we had, conveniently enough, part of the site that was burned in an autumn prescribed burn in 2012. And then part of the site that had not burned, and then another part of the site that was basically had never been burned. These were ceramics that were coming out of mammal burrows in the ruin block itself. And one thing that really surprised us is that all of the ceramics that burned in the 2012 fire, and that's what you see here in the gray, all of them were reset by the 2012 fire, every last one of them, regardless of differences in fuel context or fire intensity. Didn't matter. They were all reset. The ceramics that had been exposed to the historical fires, the ones that we know happened in the tree rings, those were absolutely identical. Those are in the red and the blue, or they're exactly identical to the ones that were getting kicked out of the ruin block. They're the same. None of those fires that happened in the previous centuries, the historical fires, ever got hot enough for long enough to reset those temper grains. But all of them, after 100 years of fire suppression, all of those burned. So these fires in the past were lower intensity, at least lower intensity than the ones that we're talking about now, even one that we might think of as a good fire in a planned prescribed context. We also know that they were small from the tree rings. So this is the kind of aggregated tree ring fire history here. The gray bars are the numbers of fires per decade. And what you can see is it might look like there's less fire in the past, but the red line is sample depth. We have what's called a fading record problem. So the further you go back in time, the fewer trees you have. And so with fewer trees, you're going to have necessarily mathematically fewer fires per decade. And you see, if you track sample size, it's actually the same. So there's the same amount of fire happening. But one thing is very different that is not related to that sample size change, and that is the abundance of widespread fires. Widespread fires, here we define them as years when 25% or more of all the trees record that fire. So basically it's a lot of fire. Before 1650, there are no years like that. After that, they're somewhat common. So basically, no big fires, all small fires during this period when Hamish people are putting lots and lots of fire on the landscape. And even see this in one of these other studies that I mentioned that we didn't do. This is a fire geomorphology study done by Jenny Fitch and Grant Mayer that showed that prior to the Hamish period, it's dominated by large, they described as kind of moderate severity fires, and that during the Hamish period, it transitions, it switches, and the deposition in these alluvial fans is all from small fires during the Hamish period. Even the ecological modeling is informative here, and so this is a lot to probably digest. So the gray are those null scenarios I mentioned, where we pretend like people were never there. We just run the tape as if the human communities were never there. And then the orange one here is one of our more intensive scenarios, where they're adding a lot of fire and they're collecting a lot of wood. But the the population reconstruction for this one is not particularly large. It's kind of on the low end of the population reconstruction, but they're doing a lot. They're doing a lot of fire. They're doing a lot of wood harvesting. And I've highlighted in the blue here, these are the periods of the ancient Wui. And so what you see here is that compared to the null, there's a lot more fire on the landscape during that ancient Wui, but it's small. And it's small not because all the fires are tiny. No, the mean is or the median is just a little bit lower, but the large fires are basically gone, right? Large fires go away. It's much more patchy in their distribution. And as a result of all that fire and all that wood harvesting, there's a lot less fuel on the landscape to burn really hot. So fire intensity actually goes down. And correspondingly, so does tree mortality. So there are a lot of things that the modeling helps us see here is that, yeah, this corroborates the tree rings and the charcoal work. There's a lot of fire, a lot of small fires, probably lower intensity fires, but this tells us something else that we don't necessarily see in the other day, which is that would have had consequences on tree mortality and survivability from those fires. We also know that Hamish fires reduce the impact of climate on fire activity. And we know that from the tree ring records, where we can combine long tree ring based climate with those fire scars. This is something that's probably very unfamiliar, and I apologize for putting a bunch of strange things out there, but this is something that's called a superposed epoch analysis plot. And so imagine that you have a long climate reconstruction. So you've got annual values for drought or for precipitation, and you know the dates of fires from the fire scars. And so you put a pin on each one of those years that had a fire. And then systematically you go and you snip the record before and after in the same amount of years for every single one of those pins, and you line them all up on the pins. And then you look at what the climate values are for those years before, those years after, and the year during the fire. And you do that in a way that allows you to assess whether or not it's random or it's actually unlikely to happen by chance. And so you look at the statistical significance of this. And so what you see here is just that, right? So the 0 years are the fire years. And then the negative numbers that we call these lag years are the years prior. So this is 1 year before, 2 years before, 3 years before, and these are the years after. You don't expect the years after to have any impact on the fire, right? But you look at them just to see if there's something wonky going on in terms of autocorrelation in the data set. And what you see from the entire Jemez mountain range to a couple of stands of different sizes is that fire years were dry and a couple years prior were wet. The wet years basically make the grasses and the needles that carry the fires when the fire year is really dry. This is so common. In fact, it's common all across the Southwest. We call it the canonical pattern. This prior wet, fire year dry, seen all over the place. But this is actually broken down. I say up here that it's post-Pueblo revolt. So this is after the Hamish ancient Wui. This is when it's not being managed by people. When you look at the period of time when it's being managed by people, you see something different, right? At the stand level, those climate relationships largely go away, right? They're entirely buffering climate impacts within stands. Then when you scale it up to the entire landscape, it changes that fire climate relationship too, because now you've got a mosaic, a patchwork of sites that are like this, that are heavily buffered in terms of climate impacts, and those that are probably less so, that are all kind of mixed together to create this aggregate signal. So even up to the entire mountain range, sites that are way far away from where Jemez people were living, you're seeing some impact of the consequence of lots and lots of small fires changing the way that climate can influence fire spread and fire activity. And I think one of the most salient lessons comes from our work with our Jemez collaborators. This is Paul Tosa, who is a very close collaborator of ours. He's a two-time governor of the Pueblo of Jemez, a very generous man, very generous with his time and with his insights. And this is one that I think is important. He told us, this is after we've been spending an awful lot of time talking about how dangerous fire is, how much respect we have to have for fire. He also wanted us to know that for Hamish people, fire adds richness to the land. And this really highlights a lacuna in our own cultural perceptions of fire, because this shows the positive cultural values for what fire can do for our world, for the places around us, for these environments, for these landscapes that we just don't have. And I think this is something that is really insightful. So what do we take away from this? Well, one thing is that many high frequency small fires in a mosaic across a WUI works, right? Particularly when you do other things to fireproof those places, you can do this, right? You can have lots and lots of small fires. And this might actually be something worth considering in the contemporary situation, because one of the big challenges about the WUI is that it's characterized by a complex mosaic of land ownership and jurisdictions that make applications of any particular policy really tricky. But maybe that's okay. Maybe lots and lots of small fires that work with those owners and jurisdictions can actually be an applicable solution to this. Regularly harvest small diameter trees. One of the things that was built into our modeling is that these small trees would be harvested, and even then, these sites are at relatively high elevation, 7,500 feet. They need a lot of wood to heat those homes, and that would have involved taking out a lot of small diameter trees. And that's, of course, what Forest Service and Park Service are trying to do. It just takes a lot of time, right, to thin those small trees to allow the fire to do the kind of maintenance work that it needs to do. But the Hamish folks were doing it because they were burning those small diameter trees at home. One of the reasons we have a really hard time with it now is they're not really economically valuable, these tiny trees. You can't make lumber out of them. Some cases, if there's a biomass energy plant nearby, you could ship them to that. But a lot of times they just get left on the landscape, burned as piles, or in some cases chipped to make for a very unusual kind of fuel bed. But if there's some way that we could find a way to do what Hamish folks were doing, which is burn them in fireplaces rather than on the landscape, you'd see maybe some of the benefits in terms of fire intensity and tree mortality associated with those fires that we'd like to get. We should really put a lot of emphasis on Firewise and Firewise programs. This worked for Jemez. There's no evidence that we saw of ancient fire impacts on these pueblos. And from the site that I showed you before, plenty of evidence that fires were burning while people were there to no ill effect, right? Partly because of the way they created defensible space and were managing the forests around those pueblos. And finally, what I want to end with, right, is the Paul Tosa lesson that we need to find ways to find positive cultural values for fire and for smoke. It can't just be this is the least bad option. That's not going to provide a lot of positive reinforcement to keep doing what we need to do. We need to find ways to create those now, and maybe Smokey has a place in doing that, changing his message to help propagate new ways of thinking about fire, about good fire. It's a good hashtag on Twitter, good fire, that maybe help us reshape our values that'll be in line with the reality and a world with fire necessarily that we can't avoid, but we can help make it be the way that we want it to be. And so those are the questions that I want to leave you with, because I can't tell you how to do this. How do you want your fire? How do you want your smoke? How can we learn? Hamish offer a certain way of doing that I think is valuable, but we have to make the decisions, those of us who live in the West, and to find a way to adapt and coexist. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of the webinar series. And many thanks to the team of folks who worked on this project. There's a lot of folks, a lot of students involved to help make this a reality. And special thanks to Chris Toya, Paul Tosa, John Galvan, and others at Pueblo of Jemez for all their work facilitating this and sharing their insights about forests and fire. And if anybody's interested, you can find the details about any of the work that I was talking about through these 3 main papers here. And so I'll close it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was so interesting. And I have to say, I definitely, while you were talking about these papers, I downloaded them and put them into my EndNote library. It's really fascinating with the ceramics. It's so cool. What an interesting method that you used in the fire paper.
We're scaling that one up.
Yeah.
Casey Hollenbach, Tammy Rittenauer, Ellis Margolis, and I have an NSF right now that is regional in scale. So we're sampling sites all across northern Arizona, northern New Mexico to do just that. Look at contexts that, I mean, we know burned a lot historically, but haven't burned since, and those that have burned recently in this prescribed burns, to see if the same pattern holds across southwestern ponderosa pine forests.
It's really cool, really cool. So I've got some questions. Some seem to be slowly rolling in. But I kind of, I'm going to start with a selfishly question of my own, if that's okay. And it's kind of a big one. And it's kind of selfish because I'm very interested in these questions too. And I kind of just wanted to hear you talk about, to you, what is a resilient ecosystem, and kind of, you know, it's like a big one, resilient ecosystem, why it matters and how kind of fire plays into that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think relationship between native people, fire, and these forests is salient, partly because it's almost like you can recognize the absence of resilience when you see it, right? So what's happening in these forests now, right, where the fires are happening and the forests are gone and they're not coming back, right? That's obviously, it's not resilient. It can't come back from that. And historically, the ability to handle fire and handle drought without losing the basic structure and function, composition, and even, you know, ecosystem services of this forest. That's what I think of when I think of in terms of resilience. And I think that the way that native folks, both Hamish folks here and some other work with the Western Apache, the way that they use fire in these landscapes complements really well the way that fire happens in there naturally from lightning fire starts, in ways that kind of bolster that resilience, that allow those forests to kind of maintain that trajectory without, you know, facing a tipping point to some alternative version of themselves. And I think that the more we dive into this, I think the more we'll learn about the role of native people over time in helping to support that, say, when climate conditions weren't particularly good, or they were particularly dangerous for tipping points and things like that. I think there's a lot still to learn, but I think we will learn a lot from that process by looking at it.
Okay. We got some good ones coming in too on different topics, and going back to what we talked about with the ceramics. And kind of seeing when they're reset. Does that also impact stone?
Well, so it can. So depends on the stone and the mineralogy of the stone, the size of the stone. So ceramics are really good for this, partly because of their size and their shape, to transmit heat. The thermodynamics of heat transfer, you know, a big boulder, right? You might have an impact on the outside, but you're not going to impact the inside. So potentially, I mean, one thing, just had a luminescence speaker here at SMU's Earth Science series. He's using rocks to date earthquake-related land exposures. And so, yeah, potentially you could do this with, I have to think about we use single grain dating, so it helps that you've got individual grains of quartz to work with, and that's I'm a big convert to that. So, working with, say, a chert flake would not work for that. But in the Jemez, right, the bandolier tuff has got enough quartz in it that you could probably do that with pieces of tuff.
Interesting. Someone said, I can't think of any positive values for smoke. Could you give any like such suggestions?
Yeah, well, no, that's a good point. I can't say that I do, but we're probably coming from the same cultural background where we just think of this as a nuisance, as a hazard.
Right.
And I mean, I said to avoid this, but especially for people in California, there's probably a lot of benefit to having, chronic, annual, low-level smoke that you can plan for, and leave town for the period of time that is happening in a good fire, planned burn. Then the catastrophic inundations on the big wind events, like when the campfire that burned Paradise was just dousing the Bay Area with smoke that was not just really bad because it's smoke in general, but also because it was burning homes and all sorts of terrible stuff. Like there, maybe it is about the lesser of evils.
Right.
But maybe I'm thinking maybe going very Little House on the Prairie or something. Oh yeah, this reminds me of this season. I love this season. It's the smoke season. This is when I go do this. I go down to the swimming hole during the smoke season. But yeah, I mean, for Hamish folks, summers would have been smoky every single year. But right, with the qualifier, with so much fuel removed, if you that modeling output, right, the fire intensity is so low that qualitatively that smoke would have been really different than even what we talk about with prescribed fires today. It would have been really different smoke. And would just been a fact of life.
Right. So I mean, yeah, like you're saying, lesser of two evils. It's not about positivity. It's about less negativity. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Someone said, I see a lot about prescribed burns that are underway today. But, and there's a lot of other questions that I've kind of seen kind of roll in is, how can we better fit fires into our lives where we don't necessarily have to prescribe them? Like, is there a way to fit fire into our lives so that it's natural?
It's a good question. I think some of the native fire practitioners in California who have a really rich fire knowledge would say that it's absolutely possible. When applications become really entrained in cultural practices, I don't like the nature culture dichotomy, so I don't want to really kind of hang my hat on that, but I think that the reality is, especially with the cultural landscape we have now, we're going to have to be involved. We can't just let lightning do this.
Right.
I mean, it certainly can't happen in the landscapes as they are now, because they're just so heavily altered from 120, 150 years of grazing and logging and fire suppression. They just can't accept fire the way that they used to. But I have real doubts that lightning is necessarily enough in all places anyway. But the more that we can engage cultural practitioners, I think the more that we can learn. And the Nature Conservancy has a really, really excellent program that is about sharing cultural fire knowledge among cultural practitioners, both those who have this and have kept it for generations, and those who want to revisit it and maybe feel that their folks have not held on to it, and just help share that, and not just in the US, it's international. That might be ways of supporting some of those practices.
Kind of on this, I feel like I could go like way into the nature culture dichotomy thing, so I won't. But someone asked, So even though fuels were managed around the ancient Wui communities, is there any evidence of wildland-caused fires in prehistoric structures? Like they actually went into the structures?
Not up at Jemez that we have seen. But I'll put the caveat that those pueblos have not been excavated in any modern way. The excavations at those were, old, borderline pot hunting kind of exercises. So I say that we haven't seen it doesn't mean that it's necessarily not there. I suspect that it's probably not. There's only one site that I know of in a forest context that might have been something like that. And it's from Arizona, the site of Chodestas. So one interpretation of the burning, it was definitely burned. And abandonment of that was that may have been from a forest fire, but I don't know. Elsewhere in that region, I've done some work, and the ancestral Pueblo folks were definitely managing fire in the landscape. I have some doubts that they would put themselves in that kind of position. And there are other reasons to believe, based on the contents of those deposits, that burn was planned, right? That was some sort of retirement of that building.
How interesting. A lot of, so a lot of people are kind of asking, California has come up a lot in these questions. And so I kind of want to ask, like, I kind of link it to your work in, different areas of the world now in Fiji and Montana, can you tell us a little bit about your work in these other areas? And then do you ever plan to work, say, in California?
Oh, it's a good question. I have a student who's going to work in California. He's just getting started this year. But he has plans to, he had done some post-fire recovery work before coming to grad school and out in California from the 2018 fires, and it made a big impression on him. That's what he's going to work on. So the work that I did in Montana was ancestral Blackfoot fire use associated with bison hunting, and there it was this really interesting patchwork of fire applications to manipulate the grazing patterns of bison so that they could kind of increase the efficiency of communal bison hunting. Really cool stuff. Very, very, very clever manipulation of the landscape to do that. But again, not huge fires, because that would actually be counterproductive. Very targeted, and evidence for them rotating it around the landscape is really neat. The Fiji work is fun. I'm still trying to write that up right now, where it's about agricultural burning, and you have a landscape that's clearly past some tipping point in the past. Questions we have is, how did that happen? When did that happen? The conventional finger has been pointed at Native people. Say, well, they just basically wiped it out with intensive agriculture, and it degraded to the point where it was no longer productive, but it was stuck in these fernlands or savannas. And I don't think so. I think it's more complicated than that. Our story looks like it's more complicated than that. And the Australia work was actually more contemporary. I was looking at ongoing processes of colonialism on fire regimes and Aboriginal people and Aboriginal fire management in the Northern Territory. That was really fast, a very, very eye-opening experience, being out on country with folks who are still burning as part of cultural practices.
That's really interesting. I think we'll kind of maybe leave it off on a kind of a broader question. And so someone asked, how do we change the Anglo perspective that large, high intensity fires are not destructive, but essential healthy forest ecosystems? I mean, living out in the Mesa Verde area in Cortez, I was just hearing, again, the other day of, prescribed burns that go awry, and people just not being very wary of this exact thing that I feel like anthropologists keep trying to say. How do we change this?
It's a good question. I mean, I have this conceit that me going around telling these stories helps somehow. Helps people see the environmental history, but maybe bits of their place in the history a little bit differently, and that by grounding it in a human history helps to personalize it a little bit, right? So okay, maybe they and their ancestors haven't lived in these contexts for generations. Maybe they're a transplant from New York who's moving to Eastern Oregon because it's pretty. But maybe they can understand, oh yeah, actually, yeah, people have been here and been a part of this, and this has been a major concern for a long time. I can see myself as part of that legacy and situate myself in that.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I you use some philosophy kind of jargon. I kind of, the applied zooarchaeology literature has used some of this kind of before, and is like, we call it a disclosive perspective, right? Is that you kind of zoom out and you allow people to appreciate naturalness, and not to support this kind of dichotomy, nature culture dichotomy, and say, like, this is very normal. You normalize it, right? Is that, I mean, that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah. And without the nature culture, humanizing it too.
Right.
I feel like some people really relate to the skinny polar bear on a lonely block of ice and thinking about climate change, but other people can't relate it until it's impacting their cousin or their aunt, or right, once it's humanized for them, then they really get it and they really relate. And so this is the archaeologist's conceit, is that, like, yeah, by putting people in this and making this human and humanizing it, kind of helps ground it in a way that says, oh, we need to do this because this is the natural thing for the forest. There's going to be the knee jerk for some people, like, well, I don't need it to be natural.
Right. Wow. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to leave this off, Chris. Humanizing. It's, it's what's important. It's what we should be doing.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure everyone at home right now is clapping. So thanks again, Chris.
Well, thank you. This has been fun. Yeah, you can find me on the Elon Musk, Twitterverse,
Yeah.
if that's your thing. And hope you enjoyed.
Yep. All right.